When I was compiling my list of games and experiences I knew would be essential for the Game My Way to 50 series, Dear Esther came to mind very early on. Widely regarded as a game that popularized, if not defined, the walking simulator genre, Dear Esther played a significant role in shaping this niche in gaming that later gave us rise to titles like Gone Home, Firewatch, and the Stanley Parable. But for me, the reason this game made the list goes beyond its genre-defining status, because there's a moment from my original playthrough that left such a lasting impression on me that it stayed with me to this day, and it truly shook me. And that's what Game My Way to 50 is about: experiences, memories, and the way gaming has not only shaped me, but also reflects who we are as gamers, sometimes in surprising ways. As we change and as gaming evolves, for many of us, it can shine a light on a core part of our identity. Now, Dear Esther is a game with no combat, no puzzles, and technically no way to lose. It offers a unique form of interaction, one that relies on the player's imagination. You can say this was a shortcut, but it's precisely how the game was designed to be. As for my own experiences, I found myself arriving at two completely different interpretations after playing through it twice, more than a decade apart. Now, I won't be delving into every detail of the story, as a game like this truly needs to be experienced firsthand and not just explained to someone. But since I'm sharing my own interpretation, a few story details will definitely leak out, so consider this your spoiler warning. Dear Esther has always been a relatively simple game, technologically speaking. Originally released in 2008 as a mod for the Source engine, the same engine behind games like Team Fortress 2 and Counter-Strike, it was later reworked into a commercial release by developer The Chinese Room, and this marked its arrival on console, sparking that debate. Does a piece of software with minimal interaction, addressing themes like unhappiness, even qualify as a game? To me, video games in many ways function like movies. Act 1 sets the scene, Act 2 builds the narrative and your relationship with the characters, and Act 3 resolves it all. But in a game, you're not just watching, you're interacting. And while not necessarily changing the outcome, you are influencing the path the characters take to get to that ultimate outcome. And like a good film, a game can invoke a range of thoughts and emotions differently in different people. And Dear Esther harnessed this power to create something I think was truly unique for the time. Now, from the start, your task as the protagonist is very simple. Walk around a deserted island. Slowly. You examine static objects in your environment, and as you explore, you also uncover story fragments presented to you in the form of narrated letters written by what appears to be the protagonist to his wife, Esther.
Dear Esther, I found myself to be as featureless as this ocean, as shallow and unoccupied as this bay, a listless wreck without identification.
The island itself is linear, ensuring players can't get lost or stray too far off course, though some side areas offer visual hints or unlock additional letters which will enrich the story. Now, the narrative itself is randomized at times, so players may experience their story in different orders or possibly miss entire story beats altogether, and this leads to the varying interpretations. But regardless of the path you choose to take, the core events of the story remain the same. Esther has died in a car accident at some point, most likely caused by a drunk driver. The island we're on is a place that both Esther and the protagonist read about in books together. We've come here to make sense of it all and are fighting to find a way through the darkness. The other details surrounding this actual tragedy and the protagonist's emotional journey, well, they remain deliberately vague. This leaves plenty of space for the player to interpret the actual events that have led up to this point. At one time, you might hear about his attempts to reconcile with the parties involved in the accident, while another one informs you of how he's chosen to burn all his belongings with no other real context. And throughout your exploration, you encounter signs of long-departed inhabitants, dilapidated structures, cave paintings and diagrams, and the occasional spectral figure lurk just beyond your reach. Dear Esther has 4 chapters in total, each lasting around 15 to 20 minutes depending on how thoroughly you choose to explore. While there are no other characters, the visuals and the hauntingly beautiful soundtrack, well, they act almost as characters themselves. From vast caves to tranquil beaches, the environment itself invokes a sense of a history, and the shifting music reacts to your surroundings, intensifying at key moments. Eventually, you will uncover enough about the storyline that you'll form your own opinion of who you are, who is at fault, and what the protagonist's motives are for visiting the island. Allusions to the story of Paul on the road to Damascus are used, along with a shepherd who was a previous inhabitant of the island. This lends a spiritual touch to the story, and while not necessary to know these things to follow along, a deeper knowledge of them undoubtedly adds to the meanings that you can actually draw from them. And that's all I want to say about the gameplay and the game design. The true meaning of Dear Esther is something that needs to be more than a basic explanation. It's an experience, one that's far more profound when you play it yourself. However, since I want to address my interpretations of the game's personal meaning to me, we do have to address some of the clues that were left behind for us, as well as the game's ending. So, this is your last spoiler warning. Multiple items can be found scattered across the island, such as damaged car parts, medical equipment, certificates, and what I believe to be Esther's wedding ring. Why are these here on this island? Are they symbolic to the story, or are they just placed there as a distraction? For example, many see the eggs that can be found in nests, one set unbroken and the other smashed, as a sign that Esther was pregnant. In the latest version of the game, an ultrasound can randomly be found among the decaying island items. Although in my experience there was no specific mention of Esther's pregnancy either before or at the time of the accident. However, many people have come to believe this is canon to the story. And you know what? They're not right or wrong. That's simply their interpretation. That's what makes Dear Esther more about the journey than the resolution. After traversing the whole island, you'll find yourself at the base of a light tower. It's an imposing structure that's been looming in the distance your whole journey above ground. This, as it turns out, has been your true destination all along. And as you ascend the hill, the weather turns harsh, almost as if nature itself is responding to your intentions. And at the summit, the game takes control, ripping it from the hands of the player. You can only sit and watch as the protagonist climbs the final steps to the top of the tower, leaving no doubt anymore about his purpose in being there. And when I first experienced this in that moment, that loss of control was jarring. I remember saying out loud, "Oh no," but perhaps a bit more colorfully. As I realized what was happening, it was a shock. And while some might say the story's conclusion was obvious from the beginning, I was so focused on uncovering deeper meanings of the island and what the mystery symbolized, that even though I thought it was clear the protagonist had suffered great loss, I never expected that I, as the player, would be the one guiding him to the end of his life. That moment where the game took away my agency, that left an indelible mark on me. Now, for those who played, just before the protagonist reaches the ground, he transforms into a bird soaring across the water, free, in control, and seemingly at peace. He soars across various objects on the island we've become familiar with, and then chooses to leave them behind and take off into the sky as the scene and the music fade out. And it might sound a bit sentimental, but the story strikes a chord with me. I've played countless games with intricate narratives and complex characters, and yet I often forget about them shortly afterward. But the brief time I spent in this protagonist's shoes leading up to that ending, it's something I've never been able to shake. And fast forward more than a decade later, I chose to revisit Dear Esther, this time playing the updated Landmark Edition released in 2017. Going in knowing the story's ultimate trajectory, I took my time, appreciating the environment and the subtle details laid about. What I didn't expect was that my personal interpretation of the experience would shift completely. Much like how Esther's death was sudden and unexpected, I experienced a personal loss 21 years ago when we lost my mother. What started as an ordinary day ended in sadness, changing our lives forever, especially for my father. Over the years, I watched him retreat into solitude, surrounding himself with familiar objects and memories, yet those things also began to be stark reminders of what had been lost. I even discovered he'd been writing letters in a journal, something I'd never fully understand the purpose of until now in light of Dear Esther's themes. So to me, does the island in Dear Esther represent a real place? I don't think so. There's a noticeable lack of context explaining just how the protagonist arrives there to begin with, and I think that's intentional. To me, the island represents the mental and emotional space people can find themselves in after enduring prolonged grief or loss. It's a place where memories linger and sadness can feel inescapable. The island isn't a literal place, but rather a state of mind, a retreat where people can just be alone with their pain. The island itself reflects this. From a distance, it all seems lush and vibrant, but when seen up close, you can notice the decay and deterioration of once beautiful spaces. The buildings hold memories, but those memories are now tainted by the passage of time. Dilapidated boats run aground on the shore, their contents scattered across the beach. That indicates both life and prosperity that have now been left to fade and decompose. As you continue your journey, the pace can feel slow and heavy, just as the grief that can weigh on you. And the intensifying of the weather as a final decision is reached, that can be seen as both the moment when a person decides to fight back against themselves, while their mental island rages against their choice. And I like to think that by the end, you're not just moving towards an irreversible end, you're choosing to leave this island, choosing a new path, while still acknowledging the pain of what came before. That island, it's always going to be there, but it's by your choice if you choose to revisit it. And I guess lending further proof to this, at least in my mind, is the fact that should you try to escape the island at any point by throwing yourself into the ocean, a voice calls out to you saying come back, and you'll find yourself back on the shore. The protagonist isn't able to achieve an escape because, at this point, he hasn't fully committed to his new path yet. Although there are clues in the final musical score that there is some finality to what has occurred, I'll leave that for you to discover. After completing Dear Esther a second time, I decided to play it through with the director's commentary turned on. And it was fascinating to hear that some of the moments that I thought were purely my interpretation have been deliberately crafted to invoke that very response. In fact, elements of fan theories from forums during the ensuing years, well, they've been woven into the Landmark Edition, not as definitive answers, but as new subtle suggestions for players to consider as part of the story. And that moment, the loss of control I felt, it actually turns out that was a debated function among the developers. They wanted the pacing to be just right, of course, but they also saw that it could be a metaphor for the loss of control we can feel when faced with tragedy. But ironically, the real reason it took away the player control at that moment was due to technical limitations of the time. The engine's ladder system at the time just wasn't up to the task, and they didn't want a dramatic moment ruined by, poor game mechanics. And regardless of how it happened, the team at the Chinese Room succeeded in creating a moment in gaming that for me will forever rank among my top experiences, right up there with some of the most shocking moments in video game history. And just right below that time that they killed Nii in Phantasy Star 2.
Come back.